Morning, the early hours before I go to sleep. Just watching Jordan Peterson and Roger Penrose, and thoroughly enjoyable, and it prompted a few thoughts. Essentially on the nature of science, and something that let's call it some of the limitations of science. The first part, I want to look at the various styles of science. And there's basically, you've got science as a pure pursuit of knowledge, a model, an algorithm, something that reduces to an equation, something that can be evidenced. And that's fairly straightforward, and it's obviously very powerful. The second element is science as dogma. And that is where somebody turns it into a religion and says, well, you haven't proved it scientifically, so it's not true. And the simple and obvious counterexample to that is, well, I presume scientists get married and I presume they claim to love their partners, but I've yet to see a scientific proof of love. So, the simple counterexample, and I'm sure it's been used before, science is a limited model, and that's, in a sense, as it should be. It's a very powerful way of examining the universe, but it is also limited, which is why the third element is that science ultimately is a hobby. If I was the best carpenter in the world and I could do amazing things with wood, that still wouldn't make me an expert in what you can do with metal or paint or sounds. And as such, science with its somewhat limited toolkit, and of course my background is maths, so I've got a great degree of respect for science, but ultimately it is still a hobby. It is still limited in its scope. Therefore, when people try and rely on science as an arbiter of truth, they are by definition limiting themselves to being the carpenter. Just as another famous carpenter, if you try and limit yourself by saying, well, my carpenter said this, again, you're also limiting yourself. And that we can also regard that as a perspective. Maybe, you may think it's more than a hobby, but ultimately, I use the term hobby in the sense that it is a consciously focused limitation of worldview. And perhaps we'll look very briefly at, ultimately, in terms of the big questions, there are really four fundamental worldviews, three that are obvious, and then mine kind of sits slightly apart, so I'll grant myself the privilege of calling it a fourth worldview. The first is what I call the atheist nihilist model, which is to say that we are only those processes which can be understood as a sack of flesh, electromagnetic interactions within our neurons, etc., etc., etc. Everything else is hocus pocus, doesn't exist, and essentially that's the atheist model. The religious model is, whichever religion you're part of, is like the truth has been given by this entity, awareness, God, via this prophet or Messiah or whatever, and that's true, and it was true 2,000 years ago or whenever it was written down, and it remains true, and that's all there is to it. By the way, but of course, each religious person is, of course, more than happy to use the products of science, so they're basically operating with two worldviews. You've got the New Age kind of model, what you might loosely call spirituality, though of course a religious person could be spiritual if we could find a definition for that. And the New Age model is broadly that we have awareness, we have a soul, and whatever. Within that, one of the nice things about New Age is that while there's broad agreement, there's also a massive range of both sources of information and a massive range of stories and narratives. And you know what? I consider that is healthy, because bear in mind my perspective, my logo, I am. We each have a sense of self, and it's really for each of us to decide which of these models that we're going to give credence to or give allegiance to in terms of running our life. Where I say I feel a little bit different, I tend to think of myself as a metaphysician, is that I am happy for any narrative to be true and any narrative to be false. Ultimately, I'm an analyst, and if it turns out that something I held to be or believed to be accurate turns out to be inaccurate, well, that's fine. We should evolve our understanding based on what we've learned. One of the key distinctions in my experience is just that everything that I hold to be a reasonable and accurate perspective is based on experience, even when it is not an experience that's authorized by science, which is where we come to the dogma, or authorized by religion. And it was quite amusing. I had no idea that religion actually considers a lot of the New Age experiences to be a threat. And in a sense, they are a threat, because there is no allegiance or worship required in the New Age. You don't have to put on robes. You don't have to go to a specific building. You just have access to whatever your awareness is. And where I distinguish myself slightly is the sense that if you like, I have a little bit of allegiance to each of the other three. But the key distinction, as far as I'm concerned, is one of trust based on experience. So really all I wanted to do in this video is just to highlight that two things, really. Firstly, it is of course, well, so maybe three things. Firstly, it is of course a highly pertinent question for all of us to wonder about where we came from and what we are and the nature of our consciousness. The second is that we are each individuals, and whatever perception you have, whatever tools you give credence to or weight to, it's just none of my business. And as long as it works for you, I mean, that's great. And at the end of the day, the only thing I would sort of offer from myself is that I consider myself a rational human with a broad base of experience, 30 odd years of experience now, and I take for granted awareness beyond the body and a lot of experiences that are available in that realm. And that I'd like to make the second part of what may be 2 or 3 videos.